During a press briefing about the Maui wildfires recovery effort, President Biden once again recounted a story about his 2004 house fire.
I didn't do anything like that, but lightning struck my house. We had to be out of that house for about 7 months while it was repaired because so much damage was done to the house and half the house almost collapsed.
While visiting the FEMA headquarters yesterday to thank emergency personnel who helped in the response to the Maui wildfires and Florida, Biden announced he will travel to Florida tomorrow morning, days after Hurricane Idalia hit western Florida. However, the visit may do little to take attention away from the federal government's Maui response. Here's a scene from the White House press briefing room earlier this week.
Given the cost of living in Hawaii, specifically in the Lahaina community, is anything being done right now? Are there considerations or efforts being made to try to raise that cap, that $700 figure for those who are there?
Yeah, the $700 figure of critical needs assistance is really just that amount of funding for some of the very immediate needs that individuals have. Every year, the main part of our assistance, which is our individual and household program, adjusts annually based on inflation. This year, it's $41,000 of a cap that individuals can get. That will get raised after the fiscal year. I don't know what that number is yet, but we do adjust that main portion of the funding that goes to individuals annually based on inflation.
Later, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre again faced another grilling by Ducey.
Okay, and it seems like the hurricane response so far is robust. Did you guys realize that the initial Hawaii wildfire response was not that good? Or is it just easier for people to get help from the White House when the president is not on vacation?
So the premise of your question and the way you posed your question, I disagree, just for the record. So if you were to do your reporting and speak to the governor of Hawaii, the senators of Hawaii, the folks on the ground, they would say that the president reacted in record time when it came to dealing with the wildfires, when it came to dealing and making sure that they got everything that they need on the federal level to deal with what was going on the ground. Let's not forget there were more than 600 federal employees on the ground already to assist with the wildfires in Maui. So your question is wrong, it's flawed in many, many ways.
Yeah, so Ducey always asks tough questions. I don't know that I necessarily disagree with him putting pressure on the White House for doing more for the folks in Maui. I will say I understand it's the governor's job to request the federal aid, and I think the governor did a really bad job in Hawaii in asking for the aid. Josh Green should have been a little bit more proactive. The folks responsible for sounding the alarm should have been more proactive. We know they stepped down. But I also think the Biden administration, it's a cop-out for them to say we've maxed out the amount of aid we can give with that $700. We know there are many sources for federal aid, especially in the case of emergencies. For example, you can get millions of dollars from HUD. In fact, it was just about 30% of the recovery funds and response funds for Sandy that came from FEMA. So it's just such a cop-out to say we've given the max we can give right now with that $700. They can call on Congress to authorize more aid to Hawaii. There's a lot of things they can do. And so while the question didn't take into consideration the whole picture, when you still take into consideration the whole picture, the Biden admin could be doing a lot more to help with the recovery and rebuilding of Hawaii.
I think it's a cop-out, too, to say, oh, well, go talk to the governor, go talk to the senators who, again, were partially responsible for the horrible response to this. Of course, they're not going to turn around and criticize President Joe Biden, but there have been tons of reporters in Maui who are actually speaking to people on the ground, actual citizens there, and they're not happy with how the government has been treating them. And even just outside of the federal official response in terms of the emergency response, Joe Biden, when he was first asked about this wildfire, was vacationing on a beach in Rehoboth and said he gave a flippant no comment, like he didn't even care to offer sympathy to the people who had lost everything, including their lives. Then on his way to Hawaii, he decided to make a stopover at a billionaire's house in Lake Tahoe, where the White House insists that he's paying market rent, which I'm sure nobody believes. It's a house of Democrat billionaire donor Tom Steyer, who previously ran for president. So he stops there at this huge mansion, then goes over to Maui, kind of bumbles around the island for a day, and then goes right back to his vacation. So it's not even just the amount of money that's given or the amount of aid, but even just the fact that he couldn't muster up a little more sympathy, a little bit more leadership in a time where the American people really needed it.
I would like to imagine that the Biden administration is in such dire straits that they needed to stop over at Tom Steyer's house for some messaging advice on how to handle the whole disaster, that they're that desperate, that that's why they're at Steyer's house. We know how his political campaign went. And we also know how Hawaii's going. For Biden to bring up a small fire when asked about what went down in Hawaii, which we know was the culmination of many decades, if not centuries, of mismanagement of land and resources on the island. It's just ridiculous to say that that's some source of empathy for him or sympathy for him. It's absurd. There's a lot more the federal government can be doing right now, and I think it's dangerous when we get into a place, and I've seen a lot of Democrats do this, defending Biden, saying to leftists who are calling for more aid that it's a right-wing talking point to say that $700 is not enough and he did all he could by giving that $700. No, absolutely not. There's a million things more he could be doing. He could have visited earlier. He could have decided, all right, vacation ends here. It turns out there's a disaster in the country that I am the leader of. Like, we are giving him so much slack, Democrats especially. And when you think about the kind of country you want to live in, a lot of Democrats say they're very compassionate. They believe in, good disaster response, taking care of people, et cetera. And they would hold someone like George Bush accountable for disaster response failures, but not Joe Biden. I really think we need to have a higher standard for someone who's in the highest public office, who can much more easily access emergency funds than anyone else in the country, than Congress, than the governors and the folks there in Hawaii. He can mobilize resources a lot faster. And by saying, well, we need Congress to authorize that money, we absolutely don't. It's been done before in the past in other responses to hurricanes like Sandy. And so it's just an absolute just mismanagement of our political rhetoric to say, oh, we're making excuses for Joe Biden. He was justified in only authorizing that amount of money because technically it's all he can. He was on vacation. There is so much more he could do, and we should just have a higher standard for those serving in public office.
Yeah, and on a more local level, in addition to the decades of land mismanagement that you mentioned, there is also just blatant incompetence within the Hawaii government and the emergency response. You had two completely unqualified individuals running the emergency response system, and then another individual who was in charge of getting water to these folks as the wildfires broke out. He apparently delayed doing so. He's previously said that water needs to be equitable, whatever that means. If that means withholding it from people who are in the midst of a wildfire because farmers need it, that seems like a pretty ridiculous explanation. So I think there needs to be some kind of investigation into how these people got appointed and how I believe the water management expert supposedly is still in his role. The other individual who was in charge of emergency response resigned supposedly for health reasons. So I guess he still gets to collect his pension or whatever as the people of Maui suffer. And then on this question of Biden's house fire that he keeps bringing up in response to this, he's not only displaying this fake sense of empathy, but he's also lying about the circumstances of the fire. It turns out that it was a small kitchen fire that was put out in about 20 minutes, yet he's claimed in various stories throughout the years that firefighters almost died fighting the fire, that he almost lost his wife and his Camaro, and that his house practically burned down. This complete escalation and exaggeration of what actually happened. And this seems to be a common theme for Joe Biden. The media constantly painted him as the so-called empath in chief. They said that he was going to be the nation's therapist. And then he gets in office and he goes and talks to Gold Star families who lost their kids during that suicide bombing in Kabul. And his response to them is to say that he also brought his son, Beau Biden, home in a flag-draped casket, which is an abject lie. His son died of brain cancer years later. Still tragic, obviously, but not at all comparable to what these families went through. Some of the individuals from Afghanistan, from the Kabul airport, who were injured in that suicide blast, also say that the first thing that he said to them was to bring up Beau Biden, as opposed to asking them how they're doing or offering them some assistance. So there's this common theme over and over again where the president tries to make other people's grief and struggles about himself, and it comes across as so tone deaf. And I just feel when people are grieving, the last thing they want to hear is, I understand what you're going through, or I know what you're going through. And the fact that no one on Joe Biden's team has steered him away from that response yet is an abject failure on their part too.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. It's especially egregious in cases of grief, of Joe Biden trying to say, I have a story that is exactly the same as yours. Joe Biden, on a regular basis, tells stories to the American public like a parent telling a fairy tale to their child before they go to sleep. They come up with new details, new embellishments, based on the reaction of their child. Joe Biden does the same thing when he's giving a speech in the U.S. If he's getting a bigger reaction, he's going to keep embellishing the story. It's absolutely absurd. I think in the case of Hawaii and the fires, we're left in a worse scenario because of the lack of messaging and response from the Biden administration. There is a very popular conspiracy theory on the internet that the wealthy folks who have bought a lot of property on Maui have all painted their rooftops blue. And that's something that's very common with people who have homes in tropical climates. But the conspiracy is that they've done this because there are these electromagnetic lasers, and that is actually what caused the fire, and the blue is immune to the lasers. Now, the fact that people are so skeptical of the elites in this country that they will take to this theory, and it's so popular on the internet because it's getting clicks and it's getting traction, because it is believable. Because people are that skeptical of the elites in the United States of America. Now, there's something at the heart of this. Definitely don't believe in this conspiracy theory, but why is it the case that the billionaires in our country are able to buy up property and land on Maui when locals are struggling to just have clean water, right? That's the real problem. Why is the land so dry and so poorly managed that it burns so easily when there is a spark? That is the real conspiracy, and it's because Hawaii, as specifically Maui, has been decimated by corporate farming, the short-term incentives of multinational corporations coming in with these cash crops like sugar, turning Hawaii into a place to pump out these low-cost crops for the local economy so that they can go and make money off of the island overseas. And they've really pushed out the locals. And then the parts of Hawaii that are very beautiful and nice to live on, we have people like Oprah Winfrey having their vacation homes there. That's the real conspiracy. We know who we should be mad at. It's very obvious to me. And so I think moving forward in the case of Hawaii, we have to pay very close attention that we don't repeat history there. And it's not BlackRock going in and buying the land because it's cheap and developing it and selling it for short-term gains over the next 10 to 15 years. We have to make sure that the recovery is relevant to the folks who live on the island. And if we see folks in public office just ignoring what's going on in Hawaii, they're going to end up worse off than they even were before the blaze.
This happens a lot in the Midwest, too, where these large corporate agricultural firms are given massive government subsidies to put in these cash crops, and then the government pays them not to farm in the future so that the land can allegedly regrow, but it actually ends up drying out the soil and leading to all kinds of environmental disaster. We'll be back with more Rising after this.